We're asking a question with this session. The question is, what kind of party are we building? And this is based on an organizational resolution that is circulated through the ranks. It's essentially intended to be an instrument in your hands for sharpening our understanding of our mission, of what we are doing with this party that we founded a year ago, with the intention of gathering the first 10,000 Bolsheviks into our ranks. And we understand that that recruitment target, that drive, the first 1,000 and the first 10,000, is really just a stepping stone for creating a mass party. What we want to do with this document and with this discussion is understand more vividly, how is this party going to grow? How do we intend to proceed from where we are today to a mass point of reference, to bringing the RCA to the status of a household name? What type of organization is it? What is the nature of a cadre organization? What is the nature of Bolshevism? Really, it's opening the door to broader questions. Understandably, a lot of people want to have a very concrete, a very practical response to this. One of the comrades in Ventura, California, submitted to the portal a little report that we published in last month's issue of The Communist. It said, people often ask us, what does the party do? Comrades might be tempted to answer with a list of organizational points. We attend weekly meetings, study Marxism, go to protests. Instead, I tried to provide a vision of our strategy to overthrow capitalism. At our current stage, we're recruiting a layer that is already drawing advanced conclusions about the need for communism and revolution. We're building a network of Marxist cadres throughout the US, skilled revolutionary propagandists and agitators who will form the nucleus of a mass communist party. I used recent examples, BLM and the Palestine Solidarity Movement, to explain why we need a clear leadership and a program to succeed. As we get organized, revolutionary ideas will be a bigger point of reference in future mass movements, and we need Bolsheviks in every key workplace, neighborhood, campus, and union, starting with you. The comrade said, everyone I explained this to was ready to give their contact information, and one even asked me point blank how he could become one of the first 10,000 Bolsheviks. Said he would sign up for dues when he got home. I think this is a model response. And what we wanted to do with this document and with this session, understand more deeply what is the entire strategy, because if we can see the strategy clearly, then everything else will flow from that. And I think the United States has a very impatient, sort of pragmatic temperament. I remember having a small group of comrades in one of our first iterations of a branch back in California, in the small town, rural Northern California that I grew up in, having a meeting about revolution. And it just so happens we were on the high school campus, sidewalks right here. One of my cousins walks by, sees us, oh, what are you guys doing? And I'm trying to get him to go away, and I said, look, we're having a meeting. Oh, well, what's the meeting about? Well, it's about revolution. And his response kind of sums up what people think when you say that word. He said, oh, do you need guns? We said, not at this stage, thank you. But a lot of people, and I would say the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the left, people who want to have a revolution, having that goal doesn't necessarily give you a clear understanding of how to arrive at a force that's capable of making that possible. And I think that's the nature of Bolshevism, is getting to the heart of this thing. It's always been a difficult thing for people to understand. How do you build the right kind of instrument? It's a very modern question. This question was answered for the first time in this book, What is to be Done? And I think this is the book you can read over and over and get more and more from each time that you read it. Admittedly, it's not easy to read the first time around. It assumes that the reader is swimming in certain waters. It's written for an audience of Russian revolutionaries in 1902 who understand the recent history of their movement, the debates that are raging. It's a polemic. But once you understand, once you get to the heart of what's being argued, all the content is there. Everything that you need in order to understand what it's going to take for us to build this kind of party, to build modern day 21st century Bolshevism, is contained in Lenin's argument. And what was happening at that time was that the revolutionary movement was boiling up. It was raging. The number of people that wanted to overthrow the Tsar were like, well, it was a human tidal wave, and they were rushing into the revolutionary movement. In fact, the Tsarist prisons were overflowing with revolutionaries, and Tsarist prison cells were a sense of cadre school. It was a university. You get locked up for 5 years, and there's not much you can do except read and write and think. And a lot of cadres got their education not in a very pleasant setting, but in a pretty effective one, after all. Lenin was one of these. He was arrested in 1895, 1 year after moving to St. Petersburg, and spent the next 5 years in Tsarist prisons and in exile camps. And I think you can imagine that he was basically cooking this up. What is to be done was a product of that long period of thinking about what the movement needed. But every time the Tsarist police would come and carry out raids and sweep away one layer of leadership, another wave would pour forward, and it would just keep growing. The problem is there was a very low political level in general. You had a network of discussion groups, but you didn't have any kind of professionalism. There was no central force to coordinate it. And so Lenin could understand that you needed to bring this thing together, you needed to concentrate it and give it professionalism. He was fighting against primitive methods, against amateurism, and he understood something that nobody else really did, at least at a degree that no one else really did, is that if you want to give it that hardened core and professionalize a force like that, that's not an organizational, administrative, technical task. That is a political task. It's an ideological task. And what that means is the step you need to take is the step of training cadres deeply and thoroughly in revolutionary theory. Now, we can put the important information, put the bottom line up front. That's what we need to do today. That is the one key to our strategy from which everything else flows, to raise our political level, to train cadres, to train hundreds and then thousands of cadres. That is the only way for us to get to 10,000, but not just to grow in numbers, but to grow in quality, to become the kind of force that can actually wield influence and be a factor in the situation. Understandably, a lot of impatient young leftists don't like this answer. And they didn't like it at the time Lenin put it forward either. They called him, well, they didn't use the word theory, bro, but, and they didn't say theory is elitist as such. Actually, they probably did make that argument. But they said that he was overrating ideology, that he was obsessed with literary, intellectual work, that it would be better if revolutionaries focused on concrete issues, practical material demands, make it realistic. They had a high regard for spontaneity. They said, this is what's happening spontaneously. The workers are moving. We should just be supporting them. Essentially, they were arguing to tail end the movement of the working class. And Lenin fought against this severely throughout what is to be done. The first chapter is all dedicated to this. You need to sharpen, and you need a high level before you can unite. He said, in order for us to unite, we need firm lines of demarcation. You need to recruit people around a theory and around a program. That is the thing that you're recruiting people to. And if you do that from the act of uniting people around a single worldview, and I think we're making progress in this room. I think we have a single worldview represented in these ranks and in the RCA today. We've come a long way. If you do this, certain things will flow organizationally from that. If you have people that think like Marxists and they have the same method when they're analyzing events, if they have a shared understanding of the mission they're trying to fulfill in history, then it creates a certain mentality, and you get iron discipline. That's a voluntary revolutionary discipline based on commitment. And that's the way that you fight amateurism. These methods that you had, basically a lack of coordination, a lack of agreement, people rowing in different directions. If you want a force that's powerful and yet flexible and agile, something that's steadfast, that's not going to break apart when it gets tested under strain of events, then you need people, you need to build it out of a special material. That's people that understand history, how history unfolds, the laws of history, and their role in that process. And that's exactly what the Bolsheviks achieved. In a sense, what is to be done is like the mission statement. In Russian, что делать? It's like what to do. It's like, here's what you do. That's what he was laying out. 15 years later, they completed the mission. 15 years late, separated 1902 from 1917. And in 1913, a few years before that victory, this is how a Tsarist police reported the impact of the Bolshevik cadres. He said, the faction of Leninists is always better organized than the others. This is an internal report, obviously. Stronger in its singleness of purpose, They're more resourceful in spreading its ideas. Its circles are scattered throughout all the cities. They're the most energetic. They seem capable of tireless struggle. They're constantly organizing. That's because they had a shared ideology. It's the political clarity that created that kind of effective organization. He also explained that the role of the party is not to tail end the working class movement, but to raise its sights, to raise its horizons, to show the way forward. We're not here just to support from the back ranks. We're here to try to explain with clarity, here's the way forward, this is the way, and try to win leadership on that basis. So how do you achieve this result is the question. I think many revolutionaries would probably like to have a well-disciplined, solid organization. But again, there wasn't clarity as to how to arrive to this thing. A few weeks ago, I went to a branch meeting in Brooklyn, and we had a really good discussion about this document. Comrade Laura was there and made a good analogy, said that capitalism is like a massive wall that needs to be battered down. And you think about the mentality of most people who are anti-capitalist, they want to batter down the wall, and they hate capitalism, and they see with an urgency, the world is burning, all these people are suffering, we need to batter this down. But they don't really think what it's going to take, so they go straight to the wall with their bare fists, and they just start hammering, and they eventually get burnt out. And the Bolsheviks are those in the crowd that are like, let's take a step back, folks, this isn't working. We need to have an instrument that's suitable for battering down a massive wall like this. And that means we need to step back from the wall and start building it. And here's a construction site over here. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to be easy, but this is the only thing. A massive battering ram that the entire working class can hold on to, and then we're going to be able to batter it. So let's go. And then you try to recruit people to this effort, and some people still don't get what you're doing, and they're like, okay, well, you're saying we should abandon the wall. We can't do that. This is urgent. People are suffering. People have immediate needs right now. You want to go have this abstract construction project over here. We don't understand what you're doing. This is basically the debate that Lenin was having with the revolutionary movement in what is to be done. And so the short version is, he also said, what is the practical step that we can take? A press. You need media. You need a way to package ideas and organize people around that so you can get on the same page that way. If you have a place where you're producing a stream of analysis, producing theory, producing reports, and it's not just written media. In our time, we have podcasts as well. We have YouTube. We have Against the Stream. We have, how many watch Against the Stream every week? Look at those hands, Fred. Let the International Center know that well, maybe that has something to do with the political unanimity we have in the party. It's nourished by weekly input. This is what Lenin was talking about. You need a way of getting people on the same page. That's what he was trying to build with Iskra. People said, oh, you're dogmatic, and you're too literary. And people say the same things. Oh, the Trots, they have papers. They write articles. Well, they didn't understand it then. They don't understand it today. And we can leave those critics to their methods. Our methods are working pretty well so far, I'd say. We can look at the question of what is a cadre organization in general. And we've often done this in the form of analogies. There are multiple analogies. It's not just the military analogy. The comrades at the center know that I've been doing a bit of a rabbit hole into military structures, and I'll get into that, but it's not the only one. Anytime you have to have large numbers of people mobilized suddenly to achieve something, you need cadres. Anytime you need large numbers of people to come and respond to an emergency and get something done, and they need to be directed by a force that's already thought through, how do you direct what needs to, what is it that we actually need to achieve, and how do we go about it? You need cadres to be the leadership of that massive operation. Think of any kind of emergency. You have a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, things need to be done. You need people mobilized. You have an epidemic breaks out, a pandemic. The CDC has its cadres. They actually have a pretty thorough explanation for their personal how to roll out a cadre. And a cadre, by the way, it means framework. It's French. A cadre is an individual part of this structure, or it could refer to the structure as a whole. So don't get confused. Sometimes you can talk about a medical cadre, and that's talking about the members of this unit. But what is a cadre? It's a special organization, and it's small, and it's tight-knit, and it has the ability to become massive. That's a pretty cool feature. And the ability to become massive very rapidly comes from certain qualities that the small group has. It's the level of expertise, the level of training, the level of professionalism and discipline, it takes a long time to basically make in concentrate the ingredients that you need on a massive scale. The concentrated version needs the ability also not just to be professional, disciplined, well-trained and educated, the ability to impart information out into a larger structure. Why framework? Because it's the outline of a much larger organization that can then be filled out. So you could think of it like a skeleton. You need a structure that's sturdy, that's not going to break, that can uphold other tissues and organs. A framework can be built out. You can think of it also as a foundation. There's a lot of different analogies. You need something solid, and then you can have a mass that rests upon this. So in the case of, like, say, a wildfire, in 2020, among all the other apocalyptic events, the western half of the U.S. was on fire, if you remember. And they mobilized 85,000 personnel, not just fire departments from all over, but all kinds of agencies. The National Guard was out there. You had all kinds of law enforcement, medical responder units. And think about 85,000 people is a pretty good sized army. They need to be fed, and they need somewhere to sleep sooner or later. And they need a lot of supplies, and they need fuel and trucks, and you need to have decision making to purchase things, and you need and the supply line has to be established very quickly. So when something like this happens, you have what's called an incident command system, and you have a general staff that's established. And the leadership of every unit, you have a department for organization, for planning, for logistics, for finance, is going to be someone that has been thoroughly prepared for this emergency, that has thought through all the contingencies, and that knows this is the resources we have, here's the plan, if this happens, we're going to do this. And they start rolling out a response, and they're going to recruit members of different agencies, and each one, it's a very thorough division of labor. They figured out decades ago that if you don't have this figured out, you can't really do it in the midst of an emergency. It leads to chaos. You don't know who's responsible for making decisions, who's in charge, and who's going to report back, and how is it going to get done. It all needs to be figured out. So you have cadres in place, and they're going to lead the response. Any incident like this typically is a question of mobilizing, you deal with the issue, and then you demobilize back to the cadre. You don't need a standing army to respond to the next wildfire. In a sense, we're trying to mobilize and not demobilize. We're trying to build our forces and not lose forces. But in the history of the revolutionary movement, sometimes you have, naturally, a massive filling out of the ranks of a revolutionary party, and then after a revolutionary defeat, look, 1905, the Bolsheviks, there was more than one Russian Revolution, right? It was 3. The first one was in 1905. The Bolsheviks were not much larger than our forces today. In the course of that revolution, together with the Mensheviks, they all came together. Huge events, right? Now the workers are looking for a revolutionary. They're pouring into the ranks of the Bolsheviks. They grow to 150,000. I mean, that's a massive expansion. After the revolution's defeated, now demoralization sets in. Anyone who joined but wasn't part of the general staff, wasn't professionalized, hadn't studied Marxism, didn't really have a long view of history, is now also demoralized, and the thing disperses. They basically reduce back down to a tiny core. That was a very difficult period. But you see that there's a cadre, there's a basic organizational feature that's happening beneath the surface. Well, this is what happens when you're responding to a wildfire. This is how armies are raised as well. And I do think that the military analogy is worth examining in detail. It's not just a metaphor. It is a cadre organization, and it's probably the most thoroughly worked out. They've had centuries to figure out how do you structure things in order to convince large numbers of people who have no military experience to rapidly get trained, become part of a unit, follow orders, and risk their lives. That's kind of a logistical issue, and it's not easy to do. And what you have are officers, and you have enlisted personnel who can make this happen. That's the cadres of a military. And the whole military, if you look at it as a big, vast, you could look at an army and just say, what's an army? That's a huge number of soldiers, and they're all wearing a uniform, and they have an arm, and they're ready to go into combat. Well, on the surface, that's what it is. In reality, it has a structure, and the structure is that's going to be permeated by sergeants. Sergeants are an enlisted soldier who's been promoted to the rank of a non-commissioned officer. And every unit is going to have sergeants, and they're going to have other ranks as well. And this is the way that troops are trained, assigned to a unit, mobilized, and then sent into battle. Look at the Civil War, for instance, to see how we also have this expansion of the troops, right? The beginning of the Civil War, you have the North. they have 15,000 enlisted soldiers, and that was in the standing army, and around 1,000 commissioned officers. They grew in the course of the war. If you count up all those who enlisted into the Northern Army, from 15,000, right? They grew to 140-fold growth to 2.1 million on the basis of those initially 1,000 officers, and then other people had to be trained rapidly to become officers. The whole thing, time is of the essence, right? When you're faced with a war. The Confederates did something similar. They had just 750 officers, and initially mustered 15,000 troops and continued to build from there. Over the course of the war, that side grew 80-fold. 1.1 million ended up joining on the southern. In total, you had 3 million soldiers enlist on both sides. And that's again, it comes down to the core of officers who's prepared to take recruits and organize them and then let them tell them what to do. I mean, imagine being in that position. You have to know the drill, right? And so, just to run through this a little bit, at the risk of bringing you all into the rabbit hole with me, we will come out on the other end, and I think it will be helpful. But stay with me here. The smallest unit of the U.S. Army or the Marine Corps it's called a team or a fire team. There's 3 to 4 soldiers, and it's going to have a leader. Even at that small scale, I think this is like the size of one of our smallest cells, right? At that small scale, the leader of a team will typically be a sergeant. In the Marine Corps, it'd be like a lance corporal. We're talking about someone with 2 to 4 years of experience. Oftentimes, in the last couple of years, we were forming a cell of 3 or 4 comrades, putting in charge of that somebody who was recruited 2 or 3 months ago. And, the military doesn't do that. we weren't sending them into combat. We were sending them into campuses and workplaces. But you put a few of these teams together, everything works in 3s or 4s. You take one unit, put them together, then you got the next unit. That's a squad. 8 to 12 people is a squad. That's going to have in its leadership a staff sergeant. So this is someone that's got like 6 years of experience. Think a large branch, 10 or 12 comrades. Do you have someone that joined in 2019 leading that? Probably not in most cases. Again, put a few squads together. Now you have a platoon, 30 to 50 people. This is going to have a commissioned officer who's been to some kind of a military academy, at minimum, a lieutenant who's been to West Point or reserve officer training or some kind of thing like this, 4 to 6 years of education to lead that group. And that's like a district. That's our Brooklyn district. There's a certain level, and each of these units has one cadre in charge of overseeing the unit who's answering to someone above them and who has basically 3 or 4 people below them giving mentorship to, giving guidance to, but also giving orders. Now, obviously there's a difference, comrades. I'm not saying, we're not building a paramilitary organization. It's different. We're not building a chain of command either. It's seniority and years of service. It's not the same for political leadership because we're not training a network to hand down orders and people to be obedient to that. That's not the way it works. We're trying to build a network that hands down like political clarity and inspiration. And you are trying to build like mentor relationships of training cadres that can help someone understand Marxism better, build their confidence, their clarity, and their ability to explain these ideas to others. Because after all, we're not going, the combat that we're going into, the class war, a cadre of a class war, think about it. The military is sending people to spread destruction and misery and to spread artillery. We're trying to spread ideas and to spread the influence of a revolutionary program. And so for that, you need cadres every bit as much as a military does, but it's a different type of cadres and it's a different type of structure. So I thought many of these things were quite interesting. They want it to be a very rock-solid structure. Sometimes it becomes not so solid, by the way. Sometimes the thread connecting soldiers to officers becomes quite tenuous, and we can talk about that. But you have a cadre density throughout the army. That's the thing that needs to be understood, is that 15 to 20% of the troops at a large scale are going to be officers or non-commissioned officers. If the RCA was a military unit, it would be a battalion, and it would probably have 150 to 200 officers and sergeants who have an average of like 6 years of experience, more at higher levels, less at lower levels. And so this is basically, if you look at the structure we're trying to build, something that's solid, something that holds together, but we're not just trying to sustain a group of 10,000. See, when we get to 10,000, that's not when we all give high fives and then our work is done. we're trying to build something that can, I mean, our work really will begin when we have these kinds of numbers. The session we just talked about is deploying cadres into high-stakes situations to be able to make decisions and to counter this vicious enemy that we've been talking about, the capitalist class, the most vicious that history has ever seen. And so we need serious leadership for that. I think it's also, yeah, there's a number of things. How much do I want to keep talking about the military before? Well, one other thing here is that I found this document. There's a lot of things on the internet, and one of them is Raising an Army, 10 Rules. And it's not a joke. This guy is a mercenary private contractor who works like for the U.S. imperialists. When they go in and destroy a country, then you know that the imperialists have to rebuild an army. They often do a bad job of it. But this guy was critical of the Pentagon's system, and he's got 10 rules. He says the first one was to drop the Pentagon's train and equip mentality. Let me just read you this. Raising armies is more sophisticated than this. It involves growing leaders, building institutions, instilling professionalism. Training and equipping alone only gives you better dressed soldiers who can shoot straighter. It goes on. Number 2 is, secondly, you have to understand this is a deeply political activity. Technical approaches that ignore the politics will fail. Here's another. I'm not going to go all 10, but another one. You have to instill a professional military ethos. That's another way for saying you need political education. You need ideological training. Starting in basic training, imbue respect for the rule of law and allegiance to the Constitution. This was, again, someone who built an army in Liberia in 2014 or early 2000s. It says Liberian recruits spent as much time in the classroom as they did on the rifle range. So when you're building, he says, if you don't do this, you're going to have an army of privates. You know, basically soldiers with no experience and no qualifications to lead and to command and to hold things together. And of course, an army like that just falls apart. He said selecting for leadership is difficult. It takes 20 years to make a colonel in the U.S. Army. A colonel, I think, would oversee like a brigade of 5,000 or something like that. And yet, the countries can't wait that long. You know, they call this line of business, they don't just call it army building, they say security sector reform. And even that is a little strong, so they call it SSR. And so the last rule is, lastly, be humble. SSR is a marathon, not a sprint. Whether one is raising an army of 2,000 or 200,000, the methods are essentially the same, differing only in scale and scope. So I think we can take some of these methods, some of them don't really apply. The firefighters are also organized in a paramilitary organization. I thought this was interesting. I mean, there's patterns to this, right? New York City has 5 borough commands. Each has a borough commander. There's 9 divisions throughout. Each division has 4 to 7 battalions led by a battalion chief. Each battalion consists of 3 to 8 firehouses. That's around 200 firefighters. Each firehouse consists of 1 to 3 fire companies, each led by a captain who commands 3 lieutenants and 12 to 20 firefighters. In short, you can see when you need to mobilize large numbers of people to do something risky, it's good to think through the leadership structure. And this obviously applies not just to, think about what was achieved in 1917. I mean, this is basically, I think you can understand it better now after going through all this detail about the military thing. You had a general staff at the beginning of that revolution. In February 1917, you had 8,000 members of the Bolshevik Party. These were experienced people. These were people that had been through a lot. The Revolutionary Party had grown, had collapsed, had grown again in 1912, 1913. World War I starts, it collapses again. It's demoralizing. You need people, if you're going to be in it for the long haul and go through all of that, you need people who have a long view of history and understand what they're really doing at a deep level, and are not just going to be swayed by how things are going in the recent period. So that's the cadres. Over time, you forge something that is based on depth and clarity. Well, that's what you had essentially at the beginning of 1917. Now, they put forward an idea, right? The idea is, yes, you've overthrown the Tsar. The February Revolution overthrew the Tsar, but set up a capitalist government, a provisional government in its place. Lenin's message is, we're not going to be part of this government. It says it's a revolutionary government. It's not. It needs to be overthrown as well. We need to bring the working class to the realization that this is not their government, and that in order to achieve the basic material, the immediate urgent demands that the working class made this revolution for. Like, we need something to eat, we need to stop sending our youth to the front into a meat grinder. In order to achieve that, you have to overthrow the capitalists. This is the message, this is the program, right? All power to the Soviets. So this 8,000 is now the cadre there to transmit the message. Like, the incident command begins, right? Now here's what we need to do. Go out and spread it. And you have agitators who know how to connect with the crowd. And you have people, correspondents, who know how to produce leaflets. And you've built up an apparatus of media that, as Lenin said, you need to build a machine and build it up to a degree of perfection that you can be able to inform the working class of Petrograd overnight. That's exactly what they built. And they informed the working class many steps of the way, night after night. Posters all over the streets of Petrograd. They were communicating. The whole thing is like, you've built a massive apparatus capable of communicating on a massive scale, communicating to millions. Now, how do you build an army of communicators? Well, you have to have a lot of discussion and political clarity, and those people need to have depth. And being a good agitator means being rooted in a very thorough, very deep, very well-rounded understanding of the issues, so that you can say, this is getting to the heart of it. You can cut through something, make it very simple. Plekhanov, one of the founders of Russian Marxism, explained the difference between propaganda and agitation. Propaganda is explaining many ideas to small numbers of people. We're talking what we're doing: books, theory, a view of history, right? A consistent ideology, a thorough philosophical foundation. That's propaganda. Agitation is few ideas to many people, but you can't just choose one or the other. There's a sequence to this. In order to create agitators who are effective, who are able to connect with the crowd, you have to train them in propaganda, very thorough training in Marxism. And at that level, then you have a Fiona Lully who can get on GB News and just send zingers and expose the hypocrisy of the ruling class.
We've seen from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is an anti-Semitic chant calling for the eradication of Israel, the eradication of Israelis, and the eradication of Jewish people.
No, you're a liar. You're a liar.
And when a Tory politician says, aren't you going to defend Britain?
When threats are growing, it requires all of Britain to lean in, as we've done in the past, hesitantly though at first, to say we're going to stand up and we're going to be firm and we're going to defend Britain.
There is no all of Britain. There's you guys and there's everyone else, right? If Putin is a threat to the working class in Britain, I don't trust Keir Starmer, I don't trust David Lammy, I don't trust the defence companies, I don't trust the billionaires, I don't trust the establishment as people who are going to defend the working class in Britain.
A class perspective, very simple. Well, 9/10 of the revolution was winning over the working class to a revolutionary program. And what Lenin understood as early as, probably back in those Tsarist prison cells, is that you need to train cadres very thoroughly in Marxist theory and unwavering Marxist theory. It's like, we have to fight eclecticism. We don't take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, they were the ones who got to the root of it. And their view is consistent. When you read one, you're reading all four. And you realize that. And any real Marxist, when you realize it, you realize it. And you can't unrealize it. There's one Marxism. There's not many Marxisms. And when you understand it, then you see its power. We're trying to build something around that realization. And that's what Lenin understood. That is the thing that you have to do. Very few people have understood it through history, but we are the thread of those who have understood it in this international. If you think about it, it's kind of like you have an uprising is also one of these emergencies that's going to have an incident command set up, and they're going to have a general staff to respond to it, and it's going to be a pretty serious thing. Now, it's going to be essentially cadre versus cadre, right? Like one structure of leadership and response versus another structure of leadership and response. And in a revolution, you have one of them win. One of them was more prepared than the other. And one of them was more ready to enlist support in terms of numbers than the other one was. And the one that thought it had solid command, see, the military structure is about command and control. That's openly what they say. We're not about command and control. We're about political clarity. We're about truth. I mean, dialectical materialism is the thing that's guiding us. And so which one is ultimately stronger? I mean, revolutions, once you have mobilized the working class, the other one can melt away very quickly. I say this because we have left down to us a pretty awesome remnant of history from 1917. This Trotsky reproduced a dialogue that took place among Tsarist officers when the February Revolution had basically had won, but they're realizing in the Central Command that they're realizing this fact through this conversation. And here's two generals, General Ivanov and General Khabalov. Okay, let me just read through the thing. How many troops are in order and how many are misbehaving? Khabalov's reply: I have at my disposal in the Admiralty building 4 companies of the Guard, 5 squadrons of cavalry and Cossacks, and 2 batteries. The rest of the troops have gone over to the revolutionists, or, by agreement with them, are remaining neutral. Soldiers are wandering through the town singly or in bands, disarming officers. Which railroad stations are guarded? Response: all the stations are in the hands of the revolutionists and are strictly guarded by them. In what parts of the city is order preserved? Response: the whole city is in the hands of the revolutionists. Wait, hold it, there's more. The telephone is not working. There's no communication between different parts of the city. What authorities are governing the different parts of the city? Response: I cannot answer this question. Are all the ministers functioning properly? Sir, the ministers have all been arrested by the revolutionists. What police forces are at your disposal at the present moment? None whatever. What technical and supply institutions of the War Department are now in your control? I have none. What quantity of provisions is at your disposal? There are no provisions at my disposal. How many weapons, artillery, and military stores have fallen into the hands of the mutineers? All the artillery establishments are in the hands of the revolutionists. What military forces and staffs are in your control? The chief of staff of the district is in my personal control. With the other district administrations, I have no connections. So in the key moment, I mean, all of the command and control counts for nothing if the whole mechanism breaks down, and history has shown many times the kinds of conditions that lead it to break down. That is, comrades, if our cadre are powerful enough, if they're strong enough, if they're prepared enough. And that is the whole point of the grounding in theory. How do we know how far along we are in creating a revolutionary military academy, a Red West Point, a revolutionary war college? Well, I think you have a good example that came out not long ago from Denmark. This was something that was circulated in RCI Bulletin 23. Now, we explained that the Danish section is doing quite well, right? It's a growing section, fast-growing section, very energetic in a small country. The working class of Denmark is just over 3 million people, which means that we have almost 1 comrade per 10,000 workers. And when they reach 1,000 comrades, there'll be 1 comrade per 3,000 workers. If what they had right now was like the U.S. population in terms of the working class, it would be like having 13,000 comrades right now in Denmark. So they're not doing bad, but that's why they're getting on the radar of the ruling class and their establishment media. And the largest paper in Denmark, the largest liberal paper, had this expose of journalists that went undercover. Well, he says I infiltrated. He says by infiltrating, I talked to a very eloquent, open-minded, friendly young communist. I expressed interest in Marxism and immediately got invited to a branch meeting. And he said, I didn't know what to expect. I thought it was going to be something absurd, probably, like people dressed up like Soviets or old-time nostalgics about the Soviet Union, or maybe hippies. I didn't know. Well, the title, I think the title of the article is something like, I infiltrated a communist meeting. I expected something absurd. What I found was the key to victory. Allow me to read to you extensively from this article. Because the way he says it, the way one of our class enemies says it is almost better than any comrade could have. The presentation, he's describing the meeting, right? There's a young comrade gives a lead off. The presentation, which was well prepared and well formulated, the level of depth of the discussion would take most people's breath away. Even relatively inexperienced attendees were able to recite and understand Marxist works and argue articulately from them. All of them had a broad knowledge of everything from socioeconomic conditions and economic history to war history and philosophy. The Revolutionary Communist Party must be said to be able to educate and train its members to a degree that enables them to clearly and convincingly present the Marxist message. Literally, even the newest members the lowest common denominator, were at a higher level than the average Dane and the average liberal. Despite great diversity of age groups and educational backgrounds, all members, new and old, are apparently encouraged to immerse themselves intellectually and study Marxist theory thoroughly. In addition, they learn to formulate their knowledge as arguments, to write speeches, to debate, and so on, with the result that even a relatively new and young member of the party can be considered a top-tuned, well-oiled machine when it comes to defending the Marxist-Leninist vision. Another observation: although the 2-hour-long debate covered a wide range, all topics and questions were considered from a Marxist perspective. In formulating their arguments, the party's members took an uncompromising point of departure from the theory behind the party's ideology. He's like, wow, they're consistent. They all have the same view. And this is the conclusion. However much we may disagree with the Marxist worldview, we must recognize that part of Marxism's gains can be attributed to the fact that without apologizing for itself, it actually tries to deliver clear and unequivocal answers to humanity's problems, big and small. We must realize, here's the end, we must realize that the ideological battle is still raging, and that in order to win this battle, we cannot deny the need for a serious weapons upgrade. If you are in doubt about how to do it, I can recommend a visit to the Revolutionary Communist Party. Every cell secretary, every comrade who's leading a cell or any other unit of the party, write this down, RCI Bulletin 23. You can print this out, study it, mark it up, and ask yourself, is my cell at this level? Are we producing this kind of atmosphere? Is this our environment? Is this where our training grounds is at? And if not, what's our plan? How are we going to get to this point where we're producing this? And it wasn't just accidental. It's not like the Danish comrades they swim in Bolshevism and then they're just ready to go. Hard work produces this result. This means that everyone, and it says it in the bulletin, they expected, look, we're going to have a contact is going to be there. All right, everyone studies and prepares and does the reading and comes with something thoughtful to deliver. And the result is, you ever have one of these cell meetings that's just electric and it just leaves you feeling with energy? And then you can go and build and you can get through another week and you can keep, that's the thing that we're trying to conjure, a factory of that. That doesn't happen automatically, and it happens only when the comrades go into it saying, that's what I want to do. I want to strengthen my cell. I'm ready to bring something. Let's bring some fire this week to the cell meeting and do it each time. The results are going to be an atmosphere that produces cadres. Now, this was the way the Russian revolutionaries did it. It's not like, it was hard and it was boring and it took years and it was not glorious. And that was part of it. And a lot of people went through the ranks and, burnt out or disappeared or got active for a little while. The things that we're up against, we're not up against a czarist officialdom that's raiding our offices and, rounding up our comrades and sending us to prison. We don't have to worry about those things. But we're up against the pressures of life, like life under capitalism. And that means too many people, they come into the ranks, this is cool, I like this. They don't really get it, what we're doing, and eventually the pressures of life are like, okay, I'm gonna go do this, and I got other priorities in my life, maybe I'll come back, and a lot of them are coming back, and it's going well. But basically, what does that mean? It means that the general staff isn't quite at the level it needs to be in order to impart the clarity to those ranks that are coming in about what we're doing. That's why we wrote this organization resolution, to try and help with that. Basically, it's like, if you understand Bolshevism, if you can impart to people who are new, welcome in, this is your party. But you're not just here because you're a communist and we're a communist and we're all going to talk about communism, and you're not just here because you agree with our views and you want it to be with a group of like-minded people. What you're joining is a training grounds. That's the thing we need to find a way to explain to contacts and new comrades, like, you're joining an ideological training grounds that will make a revolutionary out of you. And it's going to be hard and it requires your commitment, but there's a massive reward. Just get a taste of this Marxism. Once you see this clarity, that's the thing that can drive us. But you need to have that kind of environment that produces that result. How did it start in the early days? Plekhanov was the founder of Russian Marxism. Throughout the history of Bolshevism, Lenin and Trotsky were always even though he became a Menshevik and he lost his bearings, but he played a role in starting this thing out in the 1880s when there was no Marxists in Russia. and he laid the seeds, and it was patient, very thorough philosophical work. They said Lenin and Trotsky recognized that Plekhanov educated an entire generation of revolutionaries. But in these early days, what were these discussion groups like? Well, I have here a passage from a memoir of an industrial worker who had participated in one of these propaganda circles in the 1880s. This is how they described it. The propagandist acquainted us with the struggle for a better future. He pointed out the path of our movement, the broad outlines of socialism, and told us we will attain this future only by the efforts of the working class as a whole. But to be an organizer of the working class, it is necessary to be a cultivated person, to whom others could turn with their questions, and from whom they could receive definitive answers. Therefore, it is necessary to discipline and cultivate oneself. It is necessary to learn by a definite program. A good propagandist must be able to answer such questions as why there is day and night, seasons of the year, and eclipses of the sun. He must be able to explain the origin of the universe and the origin of species. In the program must be included history, the history of culture, political economy, the history of the working class. This is depth. This is the way you train a foundation that can sustain a revolutionary movement. And you cannot skip this step. We have comrades that are doing this kind of thing. We're reading Reason and Revolt and learning about materialism. I've visited comrades and I've seen, wow, our ranks are buzzing with enthusiasm for materialism and dialectics, and this is an awesome thing. This is where it begins. There's a sequence to these things, and you can't go straight to the exciting, now we're going to do the labor movement, we're going to take things by storm, and we're going to march in. The whole what is to be done was an argument against people that just wanted to jump to the fun part. Let's storm the fortress of the Tsars, and Lenin's like, okay, yeah, you and what army? The whole thing is, how are you going to build this thing? Lenin understood you need the depth first, the rest will come from that. You need the clarity of Marxism, and you need a very thorough training in this, and that takes time, and it's not fun. It's not fun to be told, this is a patient task, it's going to take years. That's what we're telling people. That's the bitter pill. But I think we're doing a pretty good job so far of convincing plenty of people that it is worth it, and that it's a rewarding process to engage in. Lenin argued that the press was central to this. Now, this is another thing that people didn't understand back then. They don't understand it now. But I think there's basically an argument here in what is to be done and in where to begin that has been overlooked by the vast majority of people that read this stuff. The press, Lenin was arguing, it's not just that Lenin loved newspapers. Like, yeah, this is cool. You got to be able to, sell these things. And that's not what he was getting at. He was saying that the press is a benchmark for something else. It's a proxy. It's a stand-in. See, if you can do this thing, then you can do this other thing. And it's a practical metric for your political strength in general to be able to produce media, to produce a press regularly, a podcast, to be able to produce a flow of information that analyzes what's happening. Now, if this flow of information is crisp and clear and precise, if it's effective, it'll spread. If it's blurry and general and vague, it'll spread. It won't spread as well, The whole thing, the question of influence, again, we want to jump to the exciting part. We want influence. We want 10,000 people. Well, if you just enlist 10,000 people, but you don't have anything to say to those people, they're going to look for, okay, what's our marching orders? 10,000. We're here to sign up for the Bolshevism. What do we do? You need a general staff ready to say, okay, well, you unit, come with me. Here's what we're going to do. Boom. And train them and start explaining things. And you need to be able to understand events thoroughly. It begins with understanding. See, the training we're trying to imbue comrades with isn't just training like our heads are in the clouds and now we're the intelligentsia and we're studying French philosophy and now we know this thing that the rest of the working class doesn't know and we're Marxists. That's not the point, comrades. You're trying to arrive at a level of clarity that is an instrument that can allow you to get back to the concrete at a higher level, to say the thing in the way that it needs to be said, that it lands, to be able to deliver clarity in a way that no other force in the political landscape is delivering. When we can do that, then we're ready for influence. And the press, the media, and I mean that broadly, the booklets we produce, the books, the things that we're producing, and against the Stream and the Communists of America, everything we're using in order to try and get our ideas out there is kind of a benchmark for our political strengths and our ability to enlist support and to get influence. And that strength manifests by you all consuming the media and spreading it. If it's effective, if it's helpful, you get an idea that's like, okay, this explained it so well. Now I understand, and I've had that moment many times. Like the article, and there's an article in here. Wow, now I get de-dollarization in the bond market. That was like, whew, that one went over my head. And this article explained it, and then, comrades, remember, I went into the office and I couldn't stop talking to everyone about, you got to read this article. You got to read this article. Media department, circle up. We're going to read this article together. The EC, can the EC have a discussion about this article? This is the way the media is supposed to work. It's like, it's not just written to entertain. It's not just written to inform. It's meant to be the ammunition, that you pick up and then you use. And so if you have a strong media department, if you have a strong apparatus for producing this, then you're, here's the other thing. Here's the other media department that we're up against, is Steve Bannon's. I've had this on my mind, and comrades know this is another sort of pet topic of mine. He's a vile reactionary. This is one of our enemies, one of our most determined enemies. But something about it, I find it effective, and when your enemy is effective, you need to pay attention to what's going on there. And what Steve Bannon is doing is, his view, he's a fundamentalist Catholic, and he's a vile xenophobe. Everything comes down to the immigrants, right? All the problems, everything he says is like, this is what the immigrants are doing, and he wants to give Trump a backbone to fight back, to railroad the courts. Like, that's his program. But what is he doing? He's taking in the news and he's churning out propaganda in a prolific way. Like the podcast of Steve Bannon is called War Room, and they produce like 4 to 6 hours of podcast streaming content every single day, 6 days a week. And it's taking the headlines of the news, the headlines of everything that's happening. And Steve Bannon has shared, like, this is my media routine. I read the Financial Times every day, and I read the Guardian, the BBC. And Steve Bannon is consuming this, and he has a team of like 15 people working on his podcast, and they're all consuming the news and they're reading it. And in his war room, there's a fireplace, and above the fireplace they have MSNBC. It's like, we have to listen to the enemy and what they're saying, and they have the producers are like taking clips. And the beginning of his episode, if you watch any of this stuff, the beginning is like just a video montage of clips. This is what the mainstream media is saying. Just a couple seconds of this and a couple seconds of that, and he gives you a feel like this is the message out there, and then he comments on it. And it's the volume of what they're able to pump out. That's what allows him to be directing a current of public opinion. People can follow that, and then you guess what? There's people that will, maybe they're workers, maybe some of them are like on the shift listening. And while they're on their shift, they're like, this stuff is going into their head. We need to make the revolutionary communist version of this. We need to counter this and we need to outdo them. We need to out-organize them. We need to out-train them and out-discipline them and out-study them and out-cadre them. That is the force that we're up against. And I think if you see how they're doing it and how effective it is, then you understand this is why we're saying the paper is important. And then what's this joker, the liberal Hassan? Is that the... And he's like...
Of course a trot is selling a newspaper. Pamphlets and newspapers. Virtually everything that you search online that is a Marxist webpage with things written on it will almost always be operated by a trot. These are... In the socialist movement, these guys are like the archivists, okay?
Okay, yeah, they don't get it. They don't see why we're doing it. We understand why we're doing it. And we need to use this to train up our cadres, and really we don't have a second to spare. That was the point on the media. Just to bring this all home, comrades, I think it's important that, we wrote this as an instrument to put into your hands to help recruit. If you understand what the party's strategy is better, then you can get people on board more easily. And you can also help comrades who are new, who are building up a commitment and saying, okay, I'm trying to understand what this is. See, when I joined, it took a while. There's an interval involved. Like, you don't just join and then, boom, I'm ready to be a Bolshevik, like a lifelong committed soldier. It takes time before it took me a couple of years. Like, I joined, and my commitment was like, I'm very interested. I was very enthusiastic, but I was like, yeah, communists. I'm surrounded by communists. I'm a communist. Yay. But it took me a while to realize what this party is going to do. and what role we're going to play in history. And when I did, then everything changed. And you can't just artificially give that in a package to people. It takes time for that to sink in. We are going to overthrow capitalism. We are not just saying these things. We are going to do it, comrades.
RCA! 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 RCA!
We've had a good start. I think that this party has become a factory of cadres like we've never seen before. And I see it every time I visit an area, every time I interact with comrades that I haven't seen for a while. The development is happening at a pace that I have never seen before. And I think that's awesome. And really, that is the only metric of our success. That's really the thing we're trying to do here. There is a surface appearance, and then there's the reality that's happening beneath the surface. And the reality is, we are a cadre organization, and we're developing cadres. And that's the only metric that matters. What matters is not the surface number. What matters is the core of cadres, the general staff that are coming out of this military revolutionary academy, who know what they're doing in life and who know what their role in history is, and who are able to impart that to others. That is the real metric of our success. Now, there's a lot of practical things that could be said. It's always important to bring this home, and I think Trotsky had the ability to go into the theory realm and then to come back down and to bring it home. And we had a quote at the end of this resolution when the first time he was addressing Americans as comrades in the left opposition. In this letter, I think it was from 1927. And I think it's kind of a cool moment when he's first corresponding with the American comrades. Well, listen to what he says. We must not for a minute lose sight of the fact that the might of American capitalism rests more and more upon a foundation of the world economy with its contradictions and crises, military and revolutionary. This means that a social crisis in the United States may arrive a good deal sooner than many think, and have a feverish development from the beginning. Hence the conclusion, it is necessary to prepare. And he says, for the majority of the socialists, he's talking about those people that are just kind of socialists on the side. Yeah, I'll overthrow capitalism with you on the weekend. But they're not really he's understanding. If you want to build something, you can't do it in that way. You can't half it. You can't just phone it in. For the majority of the socialists, and I have in view the governing strata, their socialism is a side issue, a second-class occupation accommodated to their leisure hours. He goes on to say, these gentlemen consecrate 6 days of the week to their liberal or commercial professions. On the seventh day, they consent to occupy themselves with the saving of their souls. These are not intellectual opponents, but class enemies. He's talking about the Second International in reality. But then he brings it home. Here's what you do. Bringing it home means say, here's what you do. What is the takeaway from this? Don't just leave it in the abstract. He calls on them to find the road to the youth, to dedicate their time to training up the cadres. He says, find a few contacts, young workers, they could be teenagers. Get in touch with them and develop them into cadres. He says, remain in contact, continual contact with them. Help them in their self-education. Train them in the questions of scientific socialism and systematically introduce them to the revolutionary politics of the proletarian vanguard. What it means to be a cadre is not you learn so much and you get so smart and then now you got it and you're a cadre. You don't get a rank, you don't get a badge, you don't get said that now you're a cadre. Yay, that's not the point. That's not the point. What your measure, being a cadre means you have something to offer to other comrades and you can lift them up. Your ability to build other cadres is the thing that matters. Your ability to inspire, not to impress. Your ability to educate and to bring things out in other comrades and to build their confidence in the ideas of Marxism, in the revolutionary program. It's a thing that you can, it's not about you don't speak in order to shine and show the comrades. You speak in order to help deliver clarity. That is the thing that a cadre is able to do. So I think, comrades, if we use these methods, and I think we know what we need to do. I mean, I've seen it. It's popping through the discussions all weekend. It's quite clear what we need to do, and I think we're about to do it on a scale that we've never seen before. I mean, the recruitment and the education of revolutionary cadres. If we use these methods, the methods that they've seen in Denmark, we are going to become a force like we haven't seen before. We will become a household name. It'll be a matter of time before the RCA starts sweeping aside any other left group. There's no competition out there. We're living in a theoretical desert. There's no Marxists out there. There's nobody talking about the things that we're talking about. There's nobody training cadres the way we're training. We have no competition. We have a wide open field. We need to get to work. That's the thing that we need to do. And if we do this, comrades, we will become a household name. We'll become the worst nightmare of the ruling class. And we will become the only hope for the working class.
What were Soviets? Well, Soviets essentially were basically extended strike committees that the workers used in order to organize the struggle against the bosses. The creation, they weren't created by Marx or Lenin or anyone else, they were created by the very creative power. Now, before I set off to New York, I noticed this statement from the Minnesota Republican Party that Antonio mentioned. My first thought was, oh God, they're not going to let me into the country. But after I read that, I thought it was very interesting, really. You know, they talk about the consequences of unchecked socialism and communism being real. They worry also about communism coming back to their backyards. I'd say this is the first time I've ever said this, but I agree 100% with the Republican Party. Communism is back. And I'd say also, let's look at the consequences of the Russian Revolution, for example. Pete, I think, gave a very good list of them, of some of the achievements in the previous session, but there's plenty more. You know, Russia went from a backward, dominated country, really, to one that the US itself considered as a rival. Life expectancy doubled, infant mortality halved. By the 1960s, the number of doctors per 100,000 people was 205, and that compares to 110 in Britain. And I also looked up the numbers that apparently in the US today, there's 278 doctors per 100,000 people. But also, the point is, how many people in the US can actually see these doctors is another thing to consider. On top of this, women achieved the right to vote, the right to abortion was granted, the right to divorce was granted, same-sex marriage as well was decriminalized, or same-sex relationships rather. All of this happened well before the so-called land of the free achieved some of these reforms. Now, when we're talking about the Russian Revolution today, right? But first of all, I guess we need to define our terms. Now, what actually is a revolution? You know, some of us got revolution on our t-shirts, but we need to understand what a revolution actually is. And Leon Trotsky, I think, gave the best definition of revolution. He said that it's the forcible entry of the masses onto the stage of history. And what does this mean? Well, in normal times, most people don't pay attention to politics, right? You get home from a long day at work, you don't want to open Marx's Capital. You just want to, I don't know, put on some reality TV, put on some sport, or something totally mind-numbing, I think most people want to do. However, there are times, at certain times in history, when that all turns into its opposite, when people on a mass basis involve themselves in politics. They sweep away the so-called experts, and they themselves try concretely to change history. I'd say as well, if you look at kind of revolutions in the past, you see that there are certain patterns that emerge. And I think the reason for this really is that what is a revolution? It's a development of mass consciousness, right? And mass consciousness, I think, develops according to certain laws. And if that is the case, well, if it develops according to certain laws, well, these laws can be studied, they can be understood, and then they can, if you are able to do that, well, you can use it to use this knowledge to make predictions about the future. And again, what that means is that if you have some sort of collective leadership, basically, that has imbued this method of reading society, basically, they can use these methods or this understanding, basically, to guide a future revolutionary movement to success. That really is the role of a revolutionary leadership. You know, revolutions don't happen because revolutionaries wish them into existence or create them out of nothing. Revolutions will happen whether we're here or not. A revolutionary party, it acts, essentially. It's like a catalyst in a chemical reaction. The catalyst doesn't create the reaction in itself, but it can kind of speed it up and make it, more economical, basically. Now, on paper, Russia perhaps seemed like one of the least likely places that a revolution could happen. As I said, it was a very economically backward country. 80% of the population was peasants. The GDP as well was 10 times less than the United States at that time. But it was quite a interesting country as well. Industry in Russia developed in quite an unusual way, if you like. If you compare it to Britain, so in Britain you had the slow development of industry. Gradually, small-scale production it kind of grew basically into large-scale production. But in Russia, industry really was a foreign import, if you like. You had the penetration of foreign capital into Russia, which produced very rapidly massive factories, which were the most modern factories in the world. So foreign imperialism was very important to the development of capitalism in Russia. You can see this. So by the end of the 19th century, 40% of all stock capital in the country was owned by foreign imperialism. And what this meant was that rather than, slowly being drawn into larger and larger scale production, the workers were really workers who had been torn straight from peasant life in small villages into the most massive, large-scale factories in the world. You had, so for example, the working class population of Russia at that time was around 10% of the population. But 40% of the industrial workers worked in gigantic factories. And that was more advanced even than the United States. At the same time, in the same period, the figure for the United States was 18% of industrial workers. And what this meant was these rapid changes, this rapid development of Russian society actually meant that it was very fertile ground for the growth of revolutionary ideas, the most advanced revolutionary ideas. So, what you had then in Russia, you had this monarchic state. You had the remnants of feudal labor, but combined at the same time with the most advanced factories in the world. You had a very weak bourgeoisie, actually, that was actually incredibly reliant on foreign imperialism. And the working class, if you consider it compared to other countries, it was a very small working class, but it was, relatively speaking, much stronger than the Russian bourgeoisie. And this fact terrified the Russian bourgeoisie. In the past, you can say the bourgeoisie perhaps played a revolutionary role in the French Revolution, in the English Revolution. But in Russia, the bourgeoisie was incapable of playing that role. They worried if the revolution took off, well, they might risk their own privileges, even if they might have been, superficial opponents of the kind of, monarchic state. Now, 3 revolutions occurred over a period of 13 years in Russia, which I'm going to try my best to cover. And the first of these took place in 1905. But this revolution took place when the Marxists were an extremely small force, actually. Again, I think this shows how, revolutions will happen whether there are revolutionaries there to lead it or not. In fact, there will always be a leadership of a movement, regardless of what the anarchists say. What depends, really, is whether there's a good leadership there or not. If there's no good leadership, some other leadership will be found. And an interesting thing happened in Russia at this time. So in the context of a kind of growing, seething discontent from below, the authorities, the regime tried to divert this into kind of safe channels. So they created police-controlled unions, trade unions that were controlled by police, consciously, with the conscious aim, basically, of diverting the movement into safe channels. But with no alternative, nowhere else to go, the workers did go to these unions in order to try and change their future for the better. And you had a very strange individual thrown up to the kind of top of this movement, who was actually a priest called Father Gapon. And he spoke in very militant class language, but mixed with a kind of weird, obviously, very religious language. And so this was the kind of general situation. There was a growing discontent from below, and all that was required was one spark to set off a movement. This happened with, there was an arrest of kind of like 4 or so kind of members of Father Gapon's union. And this set off a big movement. So you had a march that took place. There was a march led by Gapon on the Winter Palace. It was a very tame march. The aim of the march actually was to convince the Tsar, who they called the Little Father, to convince him out of the goodness of his heart to carry out some reforms. But even this march, this tame march, was too much for the regime, which responded with brutal repression. There was the troops fired on the marchers. You had 4,600 killed. And this massacre in itself, this massacre produced a revolution in the minds of the workers. From in the morning, the Bolsheviks, who perhaps wanted to intervene, had their leaflets torn up, they were thrown out of the march in the morning. In the evening, the workers were coming to the Bolsheviks, demanding weapons of them in order to overthrow the regime. And I think this shows something, I'd say, about consciousness, how consciousness develops. Because actually, consciousness is incredibly conservative. People will hold on to the old traditions, the old parties, the old ways of doing things for as long as physically possible. People really don't like change, actually. But it's big events like this massacre that happened that actually change things. But when consciousness changes, I think it resembles an elastic band, basically. So you have a gradual straining of an elastic band. But when an elastic band snaps, it doesn't do so gradually. It does so rapidly. And so you have a rapid transformation from people being perhaps quite conservative to people being revolutionary. Now, in 1905 also, you saw the emergence of something called Soviets. And, if you ask someone in the street what a Soviet is, probably most people, they won't know what it is. They might say, has it got something to do with Russia or something like that? So what were Soviets? Well, Soviets essentially were basically extended strike committees that the workers used in order to organize the struggle against the bosses. The creation, they weren't created by Marx or Lenin or anyone else. They were created by the very creative power of the working class. These bodies were rooted in local communities or workplaces. And they were, the representatives who were elected into these Soviets, they had no privileged position, no high wages or things like this. You had regular elections, and what this meant was that these bodies were far more responsive to the moods of the kind of local factory or whatever else that they were representing than Parliament or anything that you see today. And these bodies are not something that's specifically, a Russian phenomenon. If you look at any revolution, you see similar bodies being created. Even in sleepy old Britain, in the general strike of 1926, you saw workers' councils emerging in a similar way. Now, eventually, the 1905 revolution went down to defeat. There are plenty of reasons for this. I don't have time to go into all of them, but one of the key reasons really was the fact that, because there was no leadership, it took place in a very chaotic and uncoordinated manner. So, for example, the kind of revolution was taking off in the cities at one stage, but the rural areas were very, a few steps behind the kind of movement in the cities. But once the movement in the cities had died down, you had only then the kind of movement took off in the rural areas. So it wasn't coordinated, and in that allowed the regime to basically control it. But Lenin, no revolution really is a waste, really. And Lenin was fond of saying that defeated armies learn well. And there were big lessons that were learnt out of this movement. First of all, when the revolution was kind of taking off in the cities, well, the peasants were kind of used basically by the regime to clamp down on the movement. And this really, brought home the realization that it was necessary to link up with the peasants if the working class were to win next time. The bourgeoisie as well, the liberal bourgeoisie, as predicted, what did they do? Well, they reacted in horror, ran away from the movement. Again, that was a big lesson. You cannot trust the liberal bourgeoisie. But most importantly, I'd say, is that the very experience of going through a revolution produces a revolution in the minds of the working class, because they come to realize their own power. They come to realize also what's necessary in order to get what you want, which is unity with other members of your class. Now, around this time, there are a number of different theories about how the revolution would take place. Before I go on to these, I just want to say something. So when I was younger, I made a terrible mistake, which was to study politics at university. I don't know if anyone else has been as stupid as I was, but unlucky. But no, so the reason I wanted to mention that is because if you talk about theories at university, what are theories in university? They're just like different outfits, right? It's like, oh, I'll put on a Marxist outfit today, I'll put on a constructivist outfit tomorrow, and I'll use this to analyze that, and it's all very, it's rubbish, right? Like, what actually is a particular theory? Really, a theory, it's a hypothesis about reality, right? You look at the available data, the available information that you have, and from that, you generalize lessons and you use it to make a prediction about the future. Then you test that hypothesis against reality. It's not a study of texts or language or anything like this. We're interested in reality. Now, once I've got that out of the way, so all of the kind of, if you call them Marxist theories at this time, all of them agreed on one thing, which was that the coming revolution in Russia would be a bourgeois democratic revolution. That was the kind of the first task that faced the working class. But the big division between all of the different theories was who actually was to lead this revolution. So first of all, you had the Mensheviks, which was one strand of the Russian, at that time, the Marxist movement. And they argued that, so this is a bourgeois democratic revolution, so therefore the bourgeoisie should lead it. And what should the workers do? Well, the workers should support the liberal bourgeoisie so that they can carry out a bourgeois revolution. Then you'll have the growth of capitalism, growth of the working class. At some stage, far in the future, then you'll have the requisite situation to have a socialist revolution. Now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks disagreed with this. They pointed to the fact that the Russian bourgeoisie had become a reactionary bloc. And instead, they said, well, the working class has to lead this revolution. But the working class was obviously a very small part of Russian society, and so they would need an ally in the peasantry. And so what Lenin and the Bolsheviks said was that these classes would overthrow Tsarism, and they would establish a kind of joint state. Lenin called it a dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. But once this revolution had been accomplished, it would not be possible to go past the kind of bourgeois democratic stage, because as soon as you'd achieved this revolution, the peasantry would no longer be a revolutionary body, basically. So, what would be done? Well, you would hope then, or the idea was that the revolution in Russia would act as a spark that would light the flame across Europe and the more advanced West, right? You could have then socialist revolutions in, say, Germany, for example, which, when they had been led to success, they would, as Lenin said, show the way to the Russian working class. Now, Trotsky agreed, there's a big controversy about this, right? So Trotsky agreed that the bourgeoisie could not lead the revolution. But he said that the peasantry, really, if you look at history, the peasantry cannot act as an independent body. Why is this? Well, contained within the peasantry, you have extremely rich peasants, and you also have extremely poor peasants, basically. Also, how do the peasantry, what's their day-to-day life like, right? The peasants are separated into completely self-contained, plots of land. They have very little to do with each other. And so the peasants can't act as a unified bloc, basically, that carries out independent action. So instead, it's the working class that's the only or the most revolutionary class in society. So the working class would have to carry out the bourgeois revolution, and they would then come to power themselves. But if you have the working class coming to power, well, they're going to want something from it, right? They're not going to be happy to just stay at the bourgeois democratic stage. They're going to start asserting socialist demands, basically. And so what you have then is that, on top of that, though, so Trotsky understood as well that the conditions for socialism within Russia were not there. And so, in order for the revolution to defend itself, it would need to spread internationally, basically. So that's what you get. You have the kind of the bourgeois democratic revolution kind of merges in with the socialist revolution, which also merges in with the international revolution. That theory came to be known as the theory of the permanent revolution. Now, obviously, as I kind of alluded to, there's been a big attempt to exaggerate differences between Lenin and Trotsky on this question, with claims, that Trotsky diverged from Marxism, basically. But what explains this difference between Lenin and Trotsky? Well, I'd say, so in 1905, you've got to think, what were these two individuals doing? Well, in 1905, Trotsky was actually chair of the Petrograd Soviet. And so he had first-hand experience about how the workers might act when they came to power. And so you realize, really, that the working class would not be satisfied with, restraining themselves, basically. Lenin, on the other hand, was, he was quite a bit far removed from the 1905 revolution. So what did that mean? Well, I think he felt he didn't have enough concrete evidence in order to be as categorical as Trotsky. So his formula was more of a conditional formula. He did actually leave open the idea that the revolution could move straight on to the socialist revolution, but he had more caveats. He said it would depend on the consciousness and level of organization of the working class. Now, later, obviously, so you have followers of Stalin who attacked the theory of the permanent revolution and advocated instead the theory of stages. So, for example, in China in the 1920s, there's countless examples you could give, but here they said, look, the task is the bourgeois democratic revolution, therefore the communists need to give support to the liberal bourgeoisie. And then, at some point in the near future, there will be a socialist revolution. But what does this remind you of? It doesn't remind you of Lenin's position at all, right? It reminds you of the Menshevik position. And this theory, which was proved categorically wrong by the experiences in Russia, was trotted out everywhere by the Stalinist leaders, which led to defeat after defeat after defeat. Now, at a certain stage, so the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were two tendencies of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. I weren't interested in snappy names at that time, I don't think. But now, at some stage, these two tendencies split from each other in 1903. But Trotsky himself, he kind of remained apart from both of these tendencies. But I think there was quite a good reason for that, really. So first of all, he said the Menshevik theory of revolution was reactionary. It was reactionary now, because in order to carry out because they said that the working class could not lead the revolution, they at this stage would hold back the working class, and in that way they would act. Their theory is reactionary, basically. But interestingly, he said that the Bolshevik theory as well was reactionary. But that reactionary nature would only reveal itself after the revolution. Because if the theory says, well, once the revolution has happened, we can't go beyond bourgeois democratic demands, then at that stage, the Bolsheviks, if they stuck rigidly to that theory, would then hold back the revolution. And I think actually that Trotsky was proved right on that question. The point is, though, that he was proved wrong, I would say, because he stayed separate from these two tendencies, and he thought to himself, actually, I think the experience of the revolution itself will eventually lead to a merge of the best elements from the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. But Lenin, I think, was the only one who understood, no, actually, we need a firm struggle to create a cadre organization on the basis of solid, theory, basically. It's not, you can't just leave it up to fate, basically, to create the revolutionary organization. And Lenin was proved 100% right on that question. Now, after the defeat of 1905, Trotsky wrote that actually for the labor movement to recover at this stage, what would be needed is an economic upswing. Now, that's a bit strange, right? If you just believe what the kind of the straw man critics of Marxism say, an economic boom create class struggle. That's the opposite, right? But what Trotsky argued was that actually coming after a big defeat, an economic downswing can actually lead to demoralization of workers, because rather than wanting to struggle, instead they've lost confidence, one, in their own power to change society, so instead they just look to keep their own job safe, basically. And again, Trotsky was proved right on this. You had an upswing, or an upturn of the economy, and you saw a rise of the class struggle. So in July 1914, it reached a bit of a peak, where you had a 3-day general strike inspired by the Bolsheviks with 130,000 workers coming out. But this kind of growing movement was cut across by a dramatic dramatic event, which maybe comrades have guessed, of the outbreak of the First World War. And this came as a big shock, or it caused a big shock in the world Marxist movement, because what you had is that every so-called Marxist party, apart from in Russia and in Serbia, all of them voted for the war, essentially. And this was so shocking to the movement. I mean, even Lenin, when he read that the German SPD had voted for the war, he basically thought it was fake news created by the German general staff. And so at this time, Lenin took quite an extreme position on the war, actually. His position was, let's turn the World War into a civil war. And he also said that actually the defeat of Russia in this war would be the lesser evil compared to the victory of Russia. Now, Lenin and Trotsky slightly disagreed on this. Both agreed that this was a reactionary imperialist war that needed to be opposed. But Trotsky said that this position that Lenin was taking, actually it would be quite off-putting to the mass of the working class, because it could be misinterpreted, basically. It could be misinterpreted, basically, as support for the German imperialists. And I think Trotsky was correct in this, but the point is, Lenin was not at this time speaking to the mass of the working class. No, if you think about it, if all of these heroes of the labour movement, you imagine the IS of the INT start supporting British nationalism, that's going to cause a big, everyone's going to be a bit shocked, right? That's the sort of situation that the Marxists found themselves in that period. And so in order to cut across that, in order to make sure that none of the communists, bent to nationalism or any of that, Lenin was extremely sharp. He called it bending the stick in the other direction in order to make sure that his points were understood. And actually, at a later date, when he was speaking to the mass of the working class, he did kind of modify his tone slightly, basically. Little did he know that in 10 months' time, this guy would actually be. Little did he know that in 10 months' time, this guy would actually be in power. So let's go through the year. So the start of 1917 begins with a big strike wave in Petrograd. You also have a series of attempted palace coups at the top. And this is interesting, I think. It's interesting as well if you watch I've watched with fascination about what's happening in US politics at the moment, although it's just as mad as Britain, I think, at the moment. But the first sign of a revolution is splits at the top. And why is this? Because if the social system is going into crisis, you have different layers of the ruling class begin to blame each other for this problem. Now, the revolution itself was sparked by a mass movement of women workers, actually, who, this kind of layer of society that had been, ignored for their lives, basically, began to stand up and fight back. It was the kind of initial kind of reason for it was bread shortages, basically. And so it caused a mass movement. You had women workers marching on the factories, calling the male workers out on strike. You have, on the 23rd of February, 90,000 striking. On the 25th of February, just 2 days later, you have 250,000 people striking. In this situation, the soldiers begin firing on the workers, but this has no impact on the movement whatsoever. The masses had lost their fear, basically. And when this happens, in this scenario, no repression at all can stop the movement. Now, any army, really, is a reflection of society. So if you have class divisions in society, you also have class divisions in the army. What that means, we kind of slightly discussed it earlier, is that the rank and file of an army can have sympathy for their class brothers and sisters who are protesting. But behind every soldier is an officer who has a gun. So it's not like the army are going to break easily, right? In order to break the army needs to be, or the rank and file of the army needs to be convinced that a movement is serious, that it's ready to win and actually take power. Because, if the movement fails, these soldiers risk being court-martialed or worse. But in February, exactly this thing happened. So on the 26th of February, when ordered to fire on the workers, the soldiers turned their guns on the police. This fearsome Tsarist army basically melted into nothing, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. Now, at this stage, the Bolsheviks were quite a dominant force in the kind of more advanced layers of the working class. But a revolution, as I said, that's the entry of the masses onto the stage of history. And these masses came onto the stage of history without having, not having the experience of previous movements, basically. So they were unable to distinguish between different shades of left. They went really for the first of all, to the most well-known leaders and the most well-known parties. And it happened at that stage that the most well-known parties and leaders were the Mensheviks and another sort of socialist party, the Socialist Revolutionaries. So these parties were handed power, but as going by their theory, they didn't really want power, right? So they handed power straight over to the liberal bourgeoisie, basically. So it's a strange revolution, right? The workers lead, put their leaders in power, but then it's handed straight over to another class. Now, so this resulted basically in a bit of a strange situation, where you have basically effectively two states existing side by side, where you have on the one hand the kind of state of the liberal bourgeoisie, which was set up, called the provisional government, which was a government that was dominated by big industrialists and landlords. On the other hand, you have this system of Soviets that were linked up together on a national basis, and that's two states existing in one country. It's a system that's known as dual power. Now, some historians blame this whole situation on the stupidity of the Tsar, how out of touch and all of these things that he was. Now, he was stupid, he was out of touch. I found a great quote. So whilst the revolution was actually taking place in the country, he wrote in his diary, took a walk in a thin shirt and took up paddling again. Had tea on the balcony. Very nice, right? But it's quite interesting. If comrades one day should read the History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky, he gives these examples, but then he also quotes what historians said about Louis XVI and Charles I, two other monarchs who were overthrown in revolutions. And he says, and he actually, the quote, you could basically use exactly the same quotes for all three of these individuals. But why is this? Well, if a system is doomed and you're at the top of it, really, you can't do anything right, regardless of how intelligent you are. Think about it. Well, am I going to unleash a wave of repression? Well, all that could do in this sort of situation is lead to a backlash from below. Okay, fine. Well, shall I carry out reforms from above? Well, in that situation, it might just encourage the movement even more, right? Because that shows what struggle gets. So there's no way out for the people at the top. Not to feel sorry for them at all, but it's these big social historical forces that force these unique, seemingly individuals to kind of it's a similar personality traits, basically. Now, after the February Revolution, you have a return of many of the kind of leaders of the Bolshevik Party who had previously been in exile. And before many of these leaders had returned, the Bolshevik Party did tend to lag behind events. They were kind of taken by surprise, basically, by the February Revolution. But they eventually adapted to it, and you had their papers were kind of genuine reflection of the radical rank and file of the party. But this all changed when you had the return of Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Stalin. They completely changed the line of the paper. So, for example, they began to support the war, for example. Again, as well, they very rigidly followed Lenin's schema from 1905 as well. They said, well, look, if this is a bourgeois democratic revolution, we need to support the progressive bourgeoisie. We can't go further than the bourgeois democratic revolution. What does that mean? Let's support the provisional government, but only so far as the provisional government strengthens the revolution. But what was the provisional? The provisional government was made up of landlords and industrialists. How on earth was this government ever going to fortify or strengthen the revolution? That, I think, is proof of Trotsky's prediction, right? How this theory that Lenin had back in 1905 had now shown itself basically to be reactionary. And Lenin realized this. He was trapped in exile at this time, and he was incredibly furious. I found one quote. He said, he didn't mince his words, "Our party would disgrace itself forever, kill itself politically, if it took part in such a deceit. I would choose an immediate split with no matter who in our party, rather than surrender to social patriotism."
Next time, same